The can of baby formula slipped from Eleanor's hand and landed hard on the checkout counter. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I need to put this back. I don't have enough." The cashier sighed and rolled her eyes, scanning the item again to reverse the charge. Behind Eleanor, a line of impatient shoppers shifted their weight, some glancing at their phones, others staring directly at her with open judgment. A woman in a fur-trimmed coat clicked her tongue and muttered something about people who shouldn't have children if they couldn't feed them. Eleanor felt her face burn. She wanted the floor to open and swallow her whole. Her son, Oliver, was barely 4 months old, asleep in his stroller, unaware that his mother's hands were trembling as she pulled out the only card she had left, watching the small screen flash red one more time. Insufficient funds. She had known it would happen. She had checked her balance that morning, praying that somehow the number would be different, that some miracle would let her buy the formula her baby needed. It wasn't different. It was worse. "Do you want to remove anything else? Or just the formula?" the cashier asked. Not unkindly, but without much patience either. "Just the formula," Eleanor said. "I'll manage." She would not manage. She had exactly $11 in her purse, and the rent was due in 4 days. The apartment she shared with Oliver was small, cold in the mornings, and barely held together by hope and stubbornness. She worked 2 jobs, cleaning offices before dawn and waiting tables until well past midnight. Yet somehow the bills always grew faster than her paycheck. Oliver's father had vanished before the boy was even born, leaving nothing but a name on a birth certificate and a silence that never seemed to end. Her own parents lived 3 states away, and pride kept her from calling them, kept her from admitting that she was drowning. She pushed the stroller toward the exit, eyes down, cheeks burning, trying to disappear into the noise of the store. She did not notice the man standing near the wine aisle, dressed in a dark, tailored coat that looked entirely out of place among the fluorescent lights and plastic shopping baskets. He was tall, with sharp, tired eyes that missed nothing. He had been waiting there for almost 10 minutes, supposedly killing time before a private meeting with one of his men in the back parking lot. But his attention had drifted the moment he heard the cashier's voice rise, the moment he saw a young mother standing there with a baby, quietly falling apart in front of strangers who did not care. His name was Damian Wolfe, and very few people in this city dared to say his name above a whisper. He controlled more of it than most politicians ever would, moved money and fear through its streets, like a silent current beneath the surface. Men twice his size flinched when he entered a room. Rivals who crossed him disappeared without explanation. He had built an empire out of ruthlessness, out of never allowing himself to feel anything that could be used against him. And yet, watching this stranger struggle to hold herself together over a can of formula, something inside him shifted, quiet and unfamiliar, like a door creaking open after years of being sealed shut. He did not approach her. Instead, he watched her walk out into the parking lot, watched her load the stroller into the back of an old sedan with a cracked taillight, watched her hands shake as she buckled Oliver into his car seat. Only when she pulled away did Damien turn and walk calmly back inside. He picked up the same can of formula from the shelf where it had been returned, along with 2 more and a box of diapers, and paid for all of it in cash, refusing a receipt. Then he handed the bag to one of his men waiting by the door, a quiet, broad-shouldered man named Elliot who had worked for him for nearly a decade and never asked questions he wasn't meant to ask. "Find out who she is," Damien said, his voice low. "Discreetly. I want to know where she lives, where she works, what kind of trouble she's in. Nothing more than that, no contact, just information." Elliot nodded once and disappeared toward the parking lot, already dialing a number on his phone. Damien stood alone for a moment beneath the flickering lights of the grocery store entrance, the bag of formula and diapers useless in his hands now that she was gone. He almost laughed at himself. In 15 years, he had ordered men beaten for stealing from him, had made deals that shifted the balance of power across the entire eastern side of the city, had sat across tables from men who wanted him dead and negotiated peace through nothing but the calm certainty in his voice. And here he was, holding a bag of baby formula for a woman whose name he did not even know, feeling something close to panic that he might never see her again. He told himself it meant nothing, a moment of pity, nothing more. He had seen struggling people before. The city was full of them. But there had been something in her eyes when the card declined, some quiet dignity beneath the humiliation, a refusal to cry in front of strangers, even as everything in her posture begged to. It reminded him, uncomfortably, of a version of himself from long ago, before the money, before the power, before he had learned to bury every soft thing beneath layers of control. That night, sitting alone in the top-floor office of the building he owned downtown, surrounded by the quiet hum of the city below, Damien stared out the window and thought about a stranger with tired eyes and a sleeping baby, and could not explain why he could not stop. Elliot returned 2 hours later with a single manila folder. "Her name is Eleanor Whitfield," he said, setting it on the desk. 26 years old. Works nights at a diner on Ashford Street, mornings cleaning offices downtown. No family in the city. Behind on rent. The baby's father isn't in the picture. That's all I could get without asking questions that would draw attention. Damien did not open the folder right away. He simply looked at it, feeling the strange, unfamiliar pull of curiosity mixed with something gentler, something he had no name for yet. "Good work," he said finally. "That's all for now." Elliot hesitated at the door. "Sir, if I may ask, why does this one matter?" Damien did not answer immediately. He looked out at the city lights, thinking of a can of formula rolling across a checkout counter, of a woman's trembling hands, of the particular kind of loneliness that came from surviving entirely on your own strength, day after day, with no one to catch you if you fell. "I don't know yet," he admitted quietly. "But it does." Across the city, Eleanor sat on the edge of her bed, Oliver finally asleep in the second-hand crib beside her, and stared at the ceiling with exhaustion pressing down on her chest like a physical weight. She had made it through another day. She had one more can of formula left, enough for perhaps 2 days if she stretched it carefully. Tomorrow she would have to find a way to make more money appear out of nothing, the way she always did, through sheer will and desperation. She thought about the humiliation at the store, the stares, the whispered judgment, and pressed her palms against her eyes to keep the tears from falling. She had promised herself she would not cry anymore. Crying did not pay rent. Crying did not fill bottles. She had learned, over the past several months, that the world did not stop to notice a woman quietly breaking apart. It simply moved past her, indifferent, and expected her to keep moving too. What she did not know, what she could not have possibly imagined, was that somewhere across the city, a man with more power and more danger surrounding him than she could ever guess, was sitting in the dark, thinking about her, and quietly deciding that he was not going to let her disappear into the crowd the way everyone else had. She fell asleep that night, believing she was invisible. She was wrong. The next morning, Eleanor woke to the sound of her phone buzzing weakly on the nightstand, the battery nearly dead. It was a message from her landlord, a short, cold reminder that rent was due in 3 days, with a line at the end warning that late payments would no longer be tolerated. She read it twice, feeling the familiar tightness climb up her throat, then set the phone down and got Oliver ready for the day, moving through her small apartment with the practiced efficiency of someone who had long since stopped expecting anyone to help her. She dropped Oliver off at a neighbor's apartment, an older woman named Margaret, who watched him for a few dollars an hour while Eleanor worked, and made her way to the office building downtown where she cleaned floors before the sun came up. The work was hard and thankless, mopping floors and emptying trash cans in empty hallways while the rest of the city slept, but it paid, and paying was all that mattered now. She did not notice the black car parked quietly across the street, engine idling, a man behind tinted windows watching her walk inside with her mop bucket and her tired shoulders and her fierce, unbroken will to keep going no matter how heavy the world became. Damien watched her disappear through the glass doors and felt that same strange pull in his chest, the one he could not explain, the one that made no sense for a man like him. He had built his entire life around control, around never allowing himself to want something he could not calculate the risk of. And yet here he was, parked outside a building at 5 in the morning, watching a stranger work, feeling something dangerously close to hope. He did not know yet what he intended to do. He only knew that whatever it was, it had already begun, and there would be no undoing it now. 3 days later, Eleanor sat in a small booth at the diner where she worked the night shift, staring at a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. Her break was almost over. She had 10 minutes to eat something before returning to a floor full of tired customers and demanding orders. And she had spent 9 of those minutes simply sitting still, trying to remember what it felt like not to be exhausted. The bell above the door chimed, and a man walked in wearing a charcoal coat, his presence somehow filling the entire room without him saying a single word. Eleanor barely glanced up at first. Customers came and went all night. But something about the way the other waitress straightened her posture, the way conversations at nearby tables quieted just slightly, made her look again. He sat 2 booths away, ordered black coffee, and said nothing else. It was Damien, though she had no way of knowing his name yet, no way of knowing that this was not chance at all, that he had spent the last 3 days learning her schedule with the same careful precision he used to plan every other move in his life. She served him without recognition, her mind elsewhere, thinking about rent, about Oliver's fever the night before, about the growing list of things she could not afford. When she set the coffee down, he looked up at her, and for a brief moment their eyes met. "Thank you," he said simply. "Of course," she replied, already turning to leave. "Eleanor," he said. She froze. She had not told him her name. Her heart quickened, some old instinct rising in her chest, the kind that came from years of being a young woman alone in a city that did not always mean well. "How do you know my name?" she asked, her voice careful, guarded. Damien set down his cup, choosing his next words with more caution than he had used in a long time. "Your name tag," he said, nodding toward her chest, where a small plastic badge indeed read Eleanor in faded letters. She looked down, embarrassed, some of the tension leaving her shoulders. "Right. Sorry. Long week." "It happens," he said. "May I ask you something, Eleanor?" She hesitated, glancing toward the counter where her manager stood watching the clock. "I only have a minute." "Are you all right?" he asked. "You look like you're carrying something heavy." The question caught her off guard. No one asked her that anymore. People asked how she was, and she said fine, and they moved on, relieved not to have to actually listen to the answer. But something in his voice sounded different, quieter, more patient than she expected from a stranger in an expensive coat. "I'm fine," she said automatically. "Just tired." "Everyone says that," Damien replied, his gaze steady but not unkind. "It rarely means what it says." Eleanor felt something crack slightly in her chest, some careful wall she had built to survive the last several months, threatening to shift under the weight of a stranger's attention. She pulled it back together quickly. "I have to get back to work," she said, and walked away before he could see how close she had come to breaking. He left a large bill folded beneath his coffee cup when he departed, far more than the drink cost, along with a small note that simply read, "Buy something warm for the baby." She found it 20 minutes later while clearing the table, and stood frozen, staring at the money and the words, trying to understand how a stranger could possibly know she had a baby at all. She told herself it was a coincidence. Perhaps he had seen her stroller parked outside once. Perhaps someone had mentioned it. She folded the bill into her apron pocket with trembling hands, uncertain whether to feel grateful or afraid. Over the following 2 weeks, small things began happening around her that she could not explain. Her car, which had been making a concerning grinding noise for months, suddenly ran smoothly again after she left it overnight outside her apartment, with no memory of having it repaired. Her landlord, who had been threatening eviction over a missed payment, suddenly stopped mentioning it entirely, as though the debt had simply vanished. A grocery delivery arrived at her door one evening, paid in full, filled with diapers, formula, and warm baby clothes in Oliver's size, with no note and no explanation. At first, she was terrified. She lived in a city where nothing good happened without a price attached, where kindness from strangers usually hid something darker underneath. She considered calling the police, but what would she even report? Someone was helping her too much? Instead, she began watching more carefully, noticing details she had overlooked before. The same black car, parked at a distance, present more often than coincidence could explain. The same quiet, broad-shouldered man who seemed to appear near her apartment building at odd hours, never approaching, simply present, as though standing guard. She confronted him one evening, catching Elliot near the mailboxes outside her building as he pretended to check his phone. "Who are you?" she demanded, holding Oliver against her chest, her voice sharper than she intended. "Why do I keep seeing you around here?" Elliot looked genuinely startled, glancing toward the street, as though checking whether he was supposed to answer that question at all. "Ma'am, I think there's a misunderstanding," he said carefully. "There's no misunderstanding," Eleanor said. "I've seen you 3 times this week. Someone paid off my rent. Someone fixed my car. Someone left groceries at my door. I want to know why, and I want to know now, or I'm calling the police." Elliot's jaw tightened, weighing his options, clearly unprepared for direct confrontation from the very woman he had been quietly watching over. Finally, he sighed. "There's a man who wants to help you," he said. "That's all I can say. He means you no harm. I promise you that." "Why?" Eleanor pressed. "Why would a stranger want to help me?" "That," Elliot said, stepping back toward the street, "is something you'll have to ask him yourself." That night, Eleanor sat awake long after Oliver had fallen asleep, staring at the ceiling, turning the pieces over in her mind. A wealthy man in an expensive coat, a note about her baby, a quiet protector stationed outside her building. None of it made sense in a way that felt safe, and yet nothing about it had felt threatening either. If anything, for the first time in longer than she could remember, she had begun to feel something dangerously close to relief. The small, unfamiliar sensation of not carrying every burden entirely alone. She returned to the diner 2 nights later, some quiet instinct telling her he would come back. He did, arriving just after midnight, sitting in the same booth, ordering the same black coffee. This time, when she approached his table, she did not hide her questions. "I know it was you," she said quietly, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "The rent, the groceries, the car. I don't know how, and I don't know why, but I know it was you." Damien did not deny it. He simply looked at her, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. "Does it matter why?" "It matters to me," Eleanor said. "I don't take charity from strangers, especially strangers who seem to know things about my life they shouldn't know." "It wasn't charity," Damien said quietly. "I saw someone struggling, and I wanted to help. That's all." "That's not all," Eleanor said, her voice firmer now. "People don't just fix a stranger's car and pay off their rent because they saw them struggling once in a grocery store." Damien studied her for a long moment, weighing how much of the truth he was willing to give a woman he had known for less than 3 weeks. "My name is Damien," he said finally. "I have more money than I know what to do with, and very little in my life that feels meaningful. When I saw you that day, returning something you needed because you couldn't afford it, something about it stayed with me. I wanted to help. I still do." Eleanor searched his face, looking for the lie she was certain must be hiding somewhere beneath his calm expression, but found none. Only a strange, quiet loneliness that seemed to match something in her own chest. Something she had not expected to recognize in a man who clearly lived a life so different from her own. I don't need saving, she said finally, though her voice had lost some of its earlier sharpness. I know, Damien said, but everyone needs help sometimes, even people who are too proud to ask for it. She did not respond right away. Instead, she glanced toward the counter, where her manager was watching the clock again, and sighed. I have to get back to work. Of course, Damien said, rising from the booth, leaving another folded bill beneath his empty cup. Good night, Eleanor. She watched him leave, the bell above the door chiming softly behind him, and found herself, for the first time in months, thinking about someone other than survival. She told herself it meant nothing. She told herself she would not see him again. But some quiet part of her, the part that had learned long ago not to trust easily, already suspected that this was only the beginning of something far larger than either of them yet understood. Weeks passed, and something between them began to shift, slowly, carefully, like two people testing the strength of ice before trusting it to hold their weight. Damien started arriving at the diner more often, always ordering black coffee, always sitting in the same booth, always waiting patiently for the moments when Eleanor had a few minutes to spare between tables. Their conversations grew longer. She learned that he had grown up with very little, that he understood hunger and cold in a way that most wealthy men never did, though he never explained exactly how he had built the fortune he now carried so quietly. He learned that she had once dreamed of becoming a nurse, that she loved old books with cracked spines, that she sang softly to Oliver every night because it was the only thing that reliably made him stop crying. She still did not fully trust him. There remained something guarded in the way he spoke, careful gaps in his stories that she noticed but did not press, a stillness in his presence that suggested a life far more complicated than a simple businessman's. But slowly, despite every instinct warning her to remain cautious, she found herself looking forward to seeing him. She found herself thinking about him during her long, exhausting shifts, wondering what he was doing, wondering why a man like him would choose to spend his rare free hours sitting in a rundown diner with a tired single mother instead of somewhere far more glamorous. One evening, Damien arrived earlier than usual, before her shift officially began, and asked if she and Oliver would like to join him for dinner at a quiet restaurant nearby, somewhere away from the noise and exhaustion of her usual world. She hesitated, torn between curiosity and caution, but eventually agreed, telling herself it was simply a meal, nothing more. The restaurant was elegant, far beyond anything Eleanor could ever have afforded on her own, with soft lighting and quiet music, and servers who moved like shadows, refilling water glasses without being asked. She felt out of place at first, painfully aware of her second-hand coat and worn shoes among the polished marble floors, but Damien seemed entirely unbothered by the contrast, focused only on her, on Oliver, on making sure they were both comfortable. "You come here often?" she asked, glancing around at the quiet luxury surrounding them. "Rarely," Damien admitted. "I don't often have anyone I want to bring." Something about the honesty in his voice caught her off guard. She studied him for a long moment, searching again for whatever piece of the puzzle she still could not see. "You're a strange man, Damien," she said finally. "Rich, generous, and somehow lonelier than anyone I've ever met." He smiled faintly, though it did not quite reach his eyes. "Loneliness has a way of following certain kinds of success," he said. "The kind that requires you to keep most people at a distance." "What kind of success is that?" she asked. He hesitated, longer than she expected, and for a moment, she thought he might actually tell her the truth. Instead, he simply said, "The complicated kind," and changed the subject, asking about Oliver's first laugh, about the lullabies she sang, steering the conversation gently away from himself. Eleanor let it go, though the unanswered question settled uneasily in her chest, a small warning she chose, for now, to ignore. Meanwhile, in a world entirely separate from quiet dinners and soft lullabies, tension was building around Damien that had nothing to do with Eleanor at all. A rival organization, led by a ruthless and ambitious man named Victor Ashcombe, had spent the past several months quietly expanding into territory that had long belonged to Damien's operation. Small disputes over shipping routes had escalated into open threats. Men loyal to Damien had been approached with bribes to switch allegiance. Warehouses had been raided under suspiciously convenient circumstances. Something larger was building beneath the surface of the city, and Damien's usual sharp focus, the instinct that had kept him alive and in power for over a decade, had begun to waver, distracted by thoughts of a woman and her son who had nothing to do with any of it. His second-in-command, a sharp, calculating man named Nathaniel Rourke, noticed the shift immediately and did not approve. "You're distracted," Nathaniel said bluntly, standing across from Damien's desk one evening, as reports of Ashcombe's movements spread across the table between them. "Ever since that woman, you're missing things you never used to miss." "I'm handling it," Damien replied evenly, though even he could hear the lack of full conviction in his own voice. "Are you?" Nathaniel pressed. "Ashcombe is moving faster than we anticipated. 2 of our shipments were intercepted last week. If you're not fully focused, the whole operation becomes vulnerable, and so does everyone attached to it." Damien's jaw tightened at the implication buried within that last sentence, the reminder that anyone connected to him, anyone he cared about, immediately became a target the moment his enemies learned of the connection. He had been careful, deliberately careful, keeping Eleanor separate from every part of his real life, ensuring no one outside a small circle of trusted men knew of her existence. But he understood, with the cold clarity that had kept him alive this long, that secrets in his world rarely stayed buried forever. "No one touches her," Damien said quietly, his voice carrying the particular stillness that men in his organization had learned to fear more than shouting ever could. "No one even knows about her. Keep it that way." Nathaniel studied him for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. "For your sake," he said finally, "I hope you're right." That night, Damien sat alone in his office long after Nathaniel had gone, staring out at the city lights, weighing the 2 halves of his life against each other for the first time in years. He had built his empire on the principle of never allowing weakness, never allowing attachment, never giving anyone a lever to use against him. And yet here he was, carrying a woman and her child in his thoughts more constantly than he carried the details of his own business, a vulnerability he had sworn he would never allow himself again. He thought of walking away, of severing the connection before it grew any deeper, before it became something Ashcombe or anyone else could exploit. It would be the smart choice, the safe choice, the choice that had kept him alive through years of betrayal and violence. Instead, he found himself picking up his phone and calling her, just to hear her voice, just to know that she and Oliver were safe for one more night. She answered on the 3rd ring, her voice soft with sleep. "Damien, it's late." "I know," he said. "I just wanted to make sure you were all right." There was a pause on the line, gentle and warm. "We're fine," she said. "Oliver's asleep. I was just about to be." "Good," Damien said, and meant it more deeply than she could have known. "Good night, Eleanor." "Good night," she replied, and the line went quiet. He sat there for a long time afterward, phone still in his hand, feeling the particular weight of a decision he had already made without fully admitting it to himself. He was not going to walk away. He could not. Whatever danger that choice might eventually bring, he was no longer willing to disappear from the one part of his life that had made him feel, for the first time in longer than he could remember, something other than empty. 2 nights later, as Eleanor walked home from her diner shift along the same quiet street she always took, she noticed a car she did not recognize parked just past the corner, engine running, headlights off despite the darkness settling over the city. She quickened her pace instinctively, some old survival instinct rising in her chest, the same one that had kept her cautious and alert through years of navigating the city alone. The car did not follow her. It simply sat there, watching, before finally pulling away into the night. She did not know it yet, but the quiet, careful world Damien had built around her, the world of paid rent and repaired cars and warm dinners, had already been noticed by people far more dangerous than either of them fully understood. And the fragile peace they had both begun to trust, cautiously, quietly, was about to be tested in ways neither of them could yet imagine. The truth arrived the way most painful truths do, sideways, unexpected, from a source that had no idea of the damage it was about to cause. Eleanor had ordered a small dresser for Oliver's room, something second-hand but sturdy, and the delivery driver who carried it up her narrow staircase happened to recognize the address. He set the dresser down, glanced around the modest apartment, and said, almost cheerfully, "Didn't expect to be delivering out here. Usually only come to this side of town for Wolf's people." Eleanor froze. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" The driver, a young man with no idea he had just shattered something, shrugged easily. "Damien Wolf. Runs half the docks on the east side. My cousin works logistics for him. Guy's basically a ghost, but everyone knows the name." He glanced at her expression and faltered slightly. "You know him?" "No," Eleanor said quickly. Too quickly. "Just thought he sounded familiar." The driver left with a polite nod, entirely unaware of what he had just done. Eleanor stood in her small living room, heart pounding, Oliver babbling quietly in his playpen nearby, and felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. She sat down at her kitchen table and searched the name on her phone with trembling hands, and within minutes, the truth unfolded in front of her in fragments of old news articles, cautious speculation, and quiet, unconfirmed rumors that painted a picture entirely different from the man she had come to know. Damien Wolf, suspected head of one of the city's most powerful criminal organizations, never formally charged with anything, always just beyond the reach of the law, surrounded by whispers of violence, control, and fear that no journalist seemed willing to confirm on the record. She read article after article, her stomach twisting tighter with every line, remembering every unanswered question he had gently steered away from, every gap in his stories she had chosen not to press. The complicated kind of success, the careful, guarded loneliness. It all made a horrifying kind of sense now. She thought of Oliver, asleep just a few feet away, innocent and unaware, and felt something cold and protective harden in her chest. She had spent months building a life for her son, through nothing but her own exhausted effort, refusing to let anyone else's mistakes or dangers touch him. And now she had unknowingly let a man capable of unimaginable danger into their lives, into their home, into the fragile safety she had fought so hard to create. When Damien called that evening, as he often did, she answered with a voice so flat and controlled that he immediately knew something had changed. "Eleanor? I know who you are," she said quietly. "I know what you do." Silence stretched across the line, heavy and unmistakable. "Eleanor, let me explain." "Don't," she said, her voice cracking despite her effort to remain calm. "Don't you dare try to explain your way out of this. You let me believe you were just a wealthy stranger with too much time and too much money. You let me bring you around my son. I never lied to you about who I am with you," Damien said carefully. "I simply never told you everything." "That's the same as lying," Eleanor snapped. "Do you understand what it means for someone like you to be involved in our lives? Do you understand the kind of danger that follows a man like you?" "I would never let anything happen to you," Damien said, his voice low and steady, though beneath it, she could hear something rawer than she had ever heard from him before. "I would die before I let anyone hurt you or Oliver." "That's not a comfort," Eleanor said, her voice breaking now despite herself. "That's exactly what terrifies me." She ended the call before he could respond, sitting alone in the dark of her kitchen, tears finally falling freely after weeks of holding them back. She had promised herself she would never again build her life around a man's unpredictable world, not after Oliver's father had vanished the moment things became difficult. She would not do it again. She could not with her son's safety hanging in the balance. For the next several days, she did not answer his calls, She changed her route home from the diner, took different streets, glanced over her shoulder more than she used to, caught between fear of the man she now knew Damien truly was, and a quiet, aching part of herself that missed him more than she wanted to admit. Damien, for his part, did not push. He respected the distance she had drawn, though it cost him more than he expected. He found himself standing at his office window more often than usual, staring out at the city, thinking of a woman who had seen through every careful wall he had built, and, upon finally seeing the truth beneath it, had every right to walk away. He did not stop protecting her, however. Elliot remained stationed quietly near her building each night, careful never to be seen, and Damien ensured that every bill she owed continued to disappear before it could become a burden, even as she refused to speak to him. He told himself it was simply what any decent person would do. He knew, somewhere beneath the surface, that it was far more than that. One evening nearly 2 weeks later, Eleanor finished her shift at the diner and stepped outside into a light rain, exhausted and lost in thought, only to find Damien standing across the street beneath a street lamp, waiting for her with the quiet patience of a man who had learned long ago how to wait for things that mattered. She stopped walking, torn between the instinct to turn away and the deeper, more complicated pull that had drawn her toward him from the very beginning. "I'm not here to convince you of anything," Damien said, stepping forward carefully, keeping his distance. "I just wanted you to know that whatever you decide, I'm not going to disappear from your life the way everyone else has. Not unless you tell me to, directly, and mean it." Eleanor studied him for a long moment, rain gathering softly in her hair, her heart caught between fear and something far harder to name. "You should have told me," she said quietly, "from the beginning." "You're right," Damien admitted. "I should have. I was afraid that if you knew the truth too soon, you would never have given me the chance to show you who I actually am, beneath everything else." "And who is that?" Eleanor asked, her voice barely above the sound of the rain. "Someone who has never once, in 15 years, cared about another person the way I care about you and your son," Damien said, his voice steady, despite the vulnerability threaded through every word. "Someone who would give up everything I've built if it meant keeping you both safe." Eleanor closed her eyes briefly, feeling the weight of a decision settle over her, heavier than any she had faced since Oliver was born. She thought of her son's safety, of the danger that surrounded a man like Damien, of every warning her instincts screamed at her to heed. And yet she thought, too, of every quiet, patient kindness he had shown her. Every moment he had made her feel, for the first time in years, that she was not entirely alone in the world. "I need time," she said finally. "I need to think." "Take all the time you need," Damien said. "I'm not going anywhere." She nodded once and walked away into the rain, leaving him standing beneath the street lamp, watching her go, uncertain for the first time in a very long time whether the outcome of anything was truly within his control. He did not yet know that time was a luxury they were both about to lose. Victor Ashcombe had spent months chipping away at Damien's territory through patience and calculation, but patience only lasted so long against a man who refused to bend. When 2 more of Ashcombe's attempts to seize shipping routes failed, blocked by Damien's careful countermoves, Ashcombe began looking for a different kind of leverage entirely, the kind that did not involve warehouses or shipping lanes at all. It did not take long for whispers to reach him. A woman, a child, a diner on Ashford Street, a man as controlled and untouchable as Damien Wolfe, suddenly, uncharacteristically distracted by something outside his usual world. Ashcombe listened to the rumors with growing interest, understanding immediately what they meant. Every man had a weakness, and Damien, it seemed, had finally revealed his. "Find out everything about her," Ashcombe instructed his own men, a cold smile settling across his face. "If Wolfe cares about her, then she matters more to our position than every warehouse on the eastern docks combined." Within days, Ashcombe's men had confirmed what the rumors suggested. a young mother named Eleanor Whitfield, living quietly on the west side of the city, unaware that her name had become a weapon in a war she knew nothing about. Eleanor, meanwhile, remained lost in her own uncertainty, torn between the fear Damien's world represented and the ache of missing him more than she wanted to admit. Nearly a week had passed since their conversation in the rain, and though she had not called him, she found herself thinking of him constantly, wondering whether walking away from the one person who had made her feel less alone was truly the wisest choice, or simply the safest one. She was walking home from Margaret's apartment one evening, Oliver bundled warmly against the evening chill, when she noticed a car slow beside her on the quiet street, the same unfamiliar vehicle she had seen once before near her building. Her heart quickened instinctively, old instincts rising sharply. She quickened her pace toward her apartment building, gripping the stroller handle tightly. Two men stepped out of the car before she could reach her door. "Eleanor Whitfield?" one of them asked, his tone falsely polite, edged with something far colder beneath it. "Who's asking?" she said, keeping her voice steady despite the fear tightening in her chest, positioning herself instinctively between the men and Oliver's stroller. "We just need you to come with us," the second man said, stepping closer. "Nothing complicated. Mr. Ashcombe would like to have a conversation." Eleanor's blood ran cold at the unfamiliar name, understanding instantly, with terrifying clarity, that this had nothing to do with her at all, and everything to do with Damien. "I don't know anyone by that name," she said, backing toward her building's entrance, fumbling for her keys. The first man reached for the stroller. What happened next occurred so quickly that Eleanor would struggle to fully remember the exact sequence later. A shout from across the street. The sudden appearance of Elliot, moving faster than she had ever seen a man move, physically placing himself between the stroller and Ashcombe's men. A brief, tense standoff filled with low, sharp words she could not entirely hear, ending only when the sound of a second car screeched to a stop nearby, more of Damien's men spilling out onto the street, with an urgency that made Ashcombe's men retreat immediately, disappearing back into their vehicle and speeding away into the night. Eleanor stood frozen on the sidewalk, Oliver crying now, startled by the sudden noise and tension, her own hands shaking uncontrollably as Elliot turned to her, his expression grim. "Are you hurt?" he asked urgently. "Is the baby all right?" "We're fine," Eleanor managed, though her voice shook badly. "What just happened? Who were those men?" "I need to get you somewhere safe," Elliot said, already guiding her toward the waiting car rather than answering fully. "I'm calling Damien right now." Damien arrived at the safe house Elliot had taken her to within 20 minutes, his usual composure entirely gone, replaced by something raw and urgent that Eleanor had never witnessed from him before. He crossed the room the moment he saw her, checking her over with his eyes before pulling both her and Oliver into a careful, desperate embrace. "I'm so sorry," he said, his voice breaking in a way she had never heard. "This is exactly what I feared. This is exactly why I should have kept you further away." "Who was that man?" Eleanor demanded, pulling back slightly, Oliver still crying softly against her shoulder. "Ashcombe. Who is he?" Damien's jaw tightened, the raw vulnerability of a moment ago hardening back into the controlled danger she now understood lived beneath his calm exterior. "A rival," he said. "Someone who has been trying to take territory from me for months. He must have learned about you, about how much you matter to me, and decided to use that against me. Because of me, my son was almost taken tonight," Eleanor said, horror settling deep into her chest. "I will not let that happen again," Damien said, his voice carrying a certainty that left no room for doubt. "I promise you that." "How can you promise that?" Eleanor asked, her voice breaking. "You can't control everything, Damien. You can't protect us from your entire world forever." Damien was quiet for a long moment, the weight of her words settling heavily over him, understanding with painful clarity that she was right, that the life he had built, the empire he had spent 15 years constructing, had just become the single greatest danger to the two people he had somehow, against every instinct of self-preservation, come to love more than anything else. "You're right," he admitted finally. "I can't protect you from my world by keeping one foot inside it and one foot in yours. I have to end this, completely. Ashcombe has to understand, without any doubt, that this line can never be crossed again." "What does that mean?" Eleanor asked warily. "It means I have to finish what he started," Damien said, his voice low and resolute, "before he tries again, and before he succeeds." Eleanor searched his face, seeing the conflict there, the man torn between the violence his world demanded and the tenderness he had shown her and Oliver from the very beginning. She thought of walking away entirely, of taking Oliver somewhere far from all of this, disappearing into a life where none of this danger could ever follow them. But she thought, too, of every quiet kindness, every patient moment, every night he had called simply to make sure they were safe. She thought of the way he had looked at her in the rain, promising he would not disappear unless she truly asked him to. "I'm scared," she admitted quietly, her voice small in the dim light of the safe house. "I know," Damien said, stepping closer, careful not to overwhelm her. "I am too. Not for myself. For you. For Oliver. I have spent 15 years unafraid of anything, because I had nothing left to lose. Now I have everything to lose, and it terrifies me more than any enemy ever could." Eleanor looked down at Oliver, finally calming against her shoulder, his small fingers curled instinctively around the fabric of her shirt, and felt something settle inside her, quiet and certain despite the fear still coursing through her veins. "Then finish it," she said finally. "End this, completely, so my son never has to grow up looking over his shoulder because of a war that isn't his." Damien nodded once, something resolute settling over his expression, the calm, dangerous certainty of a man who had just been given the one reason he needed to risk everything. "I will," he said. "And when it's over, I want to build a life with you, one that doesn't require you to be afraid of what I am, if you'll let me." Eleanor did not answer immediately, the weight of everything still pressing heavily on her chest. But she did not pull away either, and for Damien, in that moment, it was enough. That night marked the beginning of the end of Victor Ashcombe's ambitions, though neither of them yet knew exactly how costly that ending would prove to be. Damien spent the following 3 days moving with a precision and urgency he had not felt in years, calling together every trusted piece of the organization he had built, mapping out exactly how far Ashcombe's reach had spread and exactly how to cut it off entirely. Nathaniel, despite his earlier warnings about distraction, worked alongside him without hesitation now, understanding that whatever doubts he once carried about Eleanor's place in Damien's life had become irrelevant the moment Ashcombe crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. "He went after a child," Nathaniel said grimly, standing beside Damien as they reviewed the final details of their plan. "Even the men who used to respect him are pulling away. Nobody wants to be associated with that." "Then we make sure everyone remembers exactly why," Damien said quietly. Eleanor and Oliver remained at the safe house under careful protection, a location known only to a small circle of Damien's most trusted men. She spent those days in a strange, suspended state of fear and quiet hope, watching the news for any hint of the danger unfolding somewhere beyond her sight, praying that whatever Damien was doing would end without more violence than necessary, though some part of her understood, with painful clarity, that his world did not often allow for gentle endings. On the third night, everything came to a head. Ashcombe, confident and arrogant despite the retreat of his own men days earlier, had arranged a meeting with several of his remaining allies at a warehouse near the docks, believing himself still in a position of strength. He did not know that Damien's men had been tracking his movements for days, quietly dismantling his operation piece by piece, cutting off supply routes, turning key allies against him through careful negotiation and undeniable proof of his reckless overreach in targeting an innocent woman and child. When Damien arrived at the warehouse that night, flanked by Nathaniel and a handful of his most loyal men, Ashcombe's confidence faltered for the first time. Wolf, Ashcombe said, forcing a calm he clearly no longer fully possessed. I assume this is about the woman. You crossed a line that should have never been crossed, Damien said, his voice carrying a stillness far more dangerous than any shout could have conveyed. You could have come after my business. You could have come after me directly. Instead, you chose to threaten a woman and her infant son. That is something I will never allow to pass quietly. Ashcombe attempted to argue, to negotiate, to remind Damien of the years of uneasy respect that had once existed between rival organizations navigating the same city. But the men who had once stood loyally behind him had already begun to see the truth. Damien's careful maneuvering had revealed over the past 3 days that Ashcombe's ambition had grown reckless and unpredictable, dangerous not just to Damien, but to anyone associated with him. One by one, without violence, without bloodshed beyond what pride alone could bruise, Ashcombe's remaining allies stepped back, refusing to stand behind a man who had endangered a child to further his own ambitions. Ashcombe, isolated and exposed, was left with no leverage, no allies, and no path forward within the city he had once hoped to dominate. This ends tonight, Damien said finally. You will leave this city, and you will never come near Eleanor Whitfield or her son again. If you do, there will be no meeting, no negotiation, and no warning. Do you understand me? Ashcombe, finally recognizing the full weight of his defeat, nodded once, stiffly, before turning and walking away into the night, his ambitions in the city finally and completely ended. Damien stood in the quiet warehouse afterward, feeling the tension of the past several days finally begin to release from his shoulders, and allowed himself, for the first time in longer than he could remember, to imagine a future that did not require constant vigilance against threats to everything and everyone he cared about. He returned to the safe house just after midnight, and Eleanor met him at the door before he could even knock, having watched anxiously from the window for hours. It's over, Damien said simply. Ashcombe is gone. He won't come near you or Oliver again. Eleanor searched his face carefully, looking for any sign of injury, any sign of the violence she had feared throughout the entire ordeal, and found only quiet, exhausted relief. You're not hurt? She asked. No, Damien said. It ended the way I hoped it would. No one was harmed. Eleanor felt something in her chest finally loosen after days of carrying fear like a stone lodged beneath her ribs. She stepped forward, closing the distance between them, and allowed herself, for the first time since discovering the truth about him weeks earlier, to fully embrace him without hesitation. Thank you, she whispered against his chest, for protecting us, for ending this the way you did. You asked me to, Damien said quietly, holding her carefully, as though she were something fragile and precious he could not risk losing. I would do far more than that for you and Oliver. They stood together in the quiet doorway for a long moment, the danger finally behind them, before Eleanor pulled back slightly, studying his face with a new kind of clarity. I've been thinking, these past few days, she said carefully, about everything. About who you are and what that means, and what kind of life it would mean for Oliver. Damien's expression grew cautious, bracing himself for whatever conclusion she had reached. And I still don't fully understand your world, Eleanor admitted. I don't know if I ever will, but I know that from the moment you paid for that formula, you have never once treated us as anything less than the most important people in your life. I know you fought to keep us safe, even at the cost of everything else you've built. That has to mean something. It means everything, Damien said quietly. I'm not asking for your world to disappear, Eleanor continued. I'm asking you to build something new, alongside me, something that doesn't require Oliver to grow up surrounded by danger. Can you do that? Damien took her hands carefully in his own, his expression steady and certain in a way she had never seen from him before. For you and Oliver, he said, I would rebuild everything from nothing, 100 times over, if it meant keeping you both safe and happy. I'm not the same man I was before I met you. I don't want to be. Eleanor felt tears gather in her eyes, though this time they were not born of exhaustion or fear, but of something far softer, something she had not allowed herself to feel in longer than she could remember. "Then let's build it," she said quietly. "Together." Damien pulled her close again, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead, and for the first time in 15 years of careful control and guarded distance, allowed himself to simply feel, without calculation, without fear of what it might cost him. Outside the safe house window, the city continued on exactly as it always had, indifferent to the quiet transformation happening within its walls. But for Eleanor and Damien, standing together with Oliver finally asleep in the next room, something entirely new had begun, fragile and uncertain, but real, and theirs, and worth protecting above everything else either of them had ever known. A year passed, quietly and steadily, in a way Eleanor had once believed impossible for someone like her. She no longer worked 2 exhausting jobs just to keep her small apartment heated through the winter. She no longer stood at checkout counters with her heart pounding, praying a declined card would somehow approve itself the second time. She now lived in a bright, spacious house on the quieter side of the city, one with a garden Oliver had already learned to run through on unsteady toddler legs, laughing in a way that still, even now, brought tears to her eyes when she remembered how close she had once come to losing everything. Damien had kept his promise. In the months following Ashcomb's departure from the city, he had slowly, deliberately restructured the parts of his life that had once required constant danger and vigilance, shifting his businesses toward ventures that no longer demanded the same violence and secrecy his earlier years had required. It had not been an easy transition, nor a complete one. Men like Nathaniel remained close, still handling certain aspects of a world Damien could not entirely walk away from overnight. But the sharpest edges had softened, and for the first time since he was a very young man, Damien found himself building something rather than merely defending it. He still remembered, vividly, standing in that grocery store over a year ago, watching a stranger's hands shake as she returned a can of formula she could not afford. He often told Eleanor, quietly, in the calm hours after Oliver had fallen asleep, that watching her that day had been the first time in over a decade he had felt anything close to hope. "You didn't know me at all," Eleanor said one evening, sitting beside him on their porch, watching the sun set gently over the garden where Oliver's toys lay scattered across the grass. "Why did you even follow me out of that store?" Damien considered the question carefully, the same way he considered everything, weighing his words before speaking them. "I've spent my whole life around people who wanted something from me," he said finally. "Money, protection, power. You didn't want anything. You were simply trying to survive with as much dignity as the world would allow you to keep. I don't think I had seen real dignity in a very long time, not until that moment." Eleanor reached for his hand, threading her fingers through his, feeling the quiet warmth of a life she had once believed entirely out of reach. "I'm glad you followed me," she said softly. "So am I," Damien replied. Inside the house, Oliver's laughter rang out as Margaret, who had become something close to family over the past year, chased him gently around the living room, delighting in the simple joy of a child who had no memory of how uncertain his earliest months had once been. Eleanor watched her son through the window, safe, warm, and entirely unaware of the danger that had once surrounded the fragile beginning of his family's story, and felt a deep, quiet gratitude settle over her, the kind that came not from wealth or safety alone, but from finally being seen, fully and completely, by someone who had chosen her, deliberately and without hesitation, from the very first moment their paths had crossed. Damien squeezed her hand gently, watching the same scene through the window beside her, and allowed himself, for the first time in his entire life, to believe that some things broken by circumstance could still, eventually, be rebuilt into something whole. "We made it," Eleanor said quietly, more to herself than to him. "We did," Damien agreed, "and we're only just beginning." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting warm gold light across the quiet garden, neither of them could have known exactly what challenges the years ahead might still bring. But for the first time in either of their lives, they faced the future together, unafraid, certain only of one simple truth that had carried them through everything that came before it. They were no longer alone.